Welcome to Jaguar Bootcamp, Advanced Default Settings. The information in this presentation is the property of Innovative Timing Systems, LLC. All of this information is confidential and may not be disclosed to anyone outside of Innovative Timing Systems or your own company without written authorization from the President of Innovative Timing Systems. This presentation is only provided to customers who are under a current support agreement that has not expired. In this module, we're going to be talking about how to set advanced settings for your defaults. And first we want to begin on this screen. You'll take a look down at the lower right and you'll see some options here that you can change. Things like database mode, minimum split, scan, and offset. Let's talk about what those mean, and then in just a moment I'm going to show you how to set those in your defaults. Database mode is essentially used to decide where chip reads are going to be written into the Jaguar database. If I click the DBase button to change our announcer screen to our database screen, you'll notice that we have a number of columns here, things like gun start and chip start and splits. A lot of splits, 10 of them in total. And then we have, of course, our finish time, which gives us gun and chip elapsed. Well, one of the things we have to think about when we're timing a race is where is the system going to be sitting and what is it we're trying to capture. So let's take a look at an example. Let's say, for example, the system's being used at maybe split 1. We would set the database mode to split 1, and what that means is every chip read that's coming into the system will be written automatically to the split 1 column. Let's use another example. Perhaps it's a triathlon and they're going to go out on a bike from transition and they're going to come back. Pretty good chance that that's going to be split 2 and split 3. So in Jaguar there's a feature where you can say this is going to be my split 2 and 3, meaning they're going to go out on the bike and they're going to come back. So what happens is when they leave transition, we're going to record the read when they go by right here in the split 2 column. When they come back on the bike after they've done the ride, we're going to record that read in the split 3 column. So Jaguar is essentially going to automatically handle the placement of the chip reads in the correct columns. Now there's a little bit of advanced knowledge you need to have if you're using one of these modes where we have, say, split 2 and 3 or perhaps 1, 2, 3. And that is our very next box that we see, and that's our minimum split. For Jaguar to know how long the person has to be out on the bike or perhaps on the run before it records the next read, we need to set the minimum split. So let's return back to our bike example, split 2 and 3. If we were doing perhaps a half Ironman distance race, we know that the bike is 56 miles. Pretty unlikely anybody's going to finish that bike ride in less than 90 minutes or perhaps even close to 2 hours. And what might happen is if they come back early, maybe they've decided to drop out of the race, we don't want to record their split 3 time yet if they come back early. So what we can do is we can use minimum split and we can decide how much time has to elapse between the split 2 before we record split 3. So for example, if we set that, say, to 60 minutes, one of our options, that would essentially say when they come out on the bike, we'll record their time in split 2, but they have to have been gone for at least 60 minutes before we'll record the split 3. If they come back earlier than that, it's not going to get written to the database because it's not a valid read. So essentially what you want to think about when you're using a database mode where you have multiple splits, for example, maybe split 1, 2, 3, 4, you might say, well, I'm doing a course where they have to come back by the timing system. It might look like a loop or a lap type course. And essentially what we might say is they have to have been gone for at least 10 minutes for each lap. Well, we could do that. Now Jaguar actually has a database mode. If you scroll all the way to the bottom, it has a mode down there that says, hey, I want to run in laps, and you could set this to laps mode. It's an entirely different database mode where we can track up to 500 laps per participant. So if we were doing a lap race with a lot of the laps, we wouldn't use split 1, 2, 3, 4. We would use laps mode. Where we're going to use these splits typically are things like a marathon, for example. You might have the system out on the course and say, it turns out that I'm at split 3, and so I'm going to set the database mode to that. So that's how the database mode works. It essentially allows us to tell Jaguar, while you're reading chips, I want you to write it to a particular column. The minimum split is what allows us to then say how much time has to go by before I'll record the next chip read, assuming that you're using a database mode that's more than 1 point. All right, now below that you'll see the scan. This is really important for you to understand because there might be a little confusion. You might say, well, scan is how often I'm going to go read a chip. Not at all. What scan does is it decides how often Jaguar software on the laptop or desktop, whatever you're using, it says this is how often you're going to go out to the reader hardware and you're going to retrieve my chips that are waiting. You see, when the reader is actually reading the timing chips, it's storing that in memory actually on the reader. And depending on the size of system you have, it can store anywhere from 500 to 5,000 chip reads. It can store a lot of information out on that reader. And Jaguar needs to know how often do you want me to go out and collect that information. Well, normally we would set this to say 1 if we were at a finish line. However, and this is a big however, if we're at the start line of a race, you're going to want to set this to 5 or even 10 seconds. Now let me explain what that means. If I set it to 10 seconds, when Jaguar goes out to collect my chip reads, it's only going to show them scrolling on the screen every 10 seconds. If I set it to 1, well, it would show obviously every 1 second. The difference? Well, every time Jaguar on the laptop has to go out to the hardware and retrieve those chip reads, that takes time away from the reader doing its fundamental task, and that is trying to read chips. So at a finish line where there's not a high density or a split point that's not a high density, we'll run this at 1 because we get instant feedback when somebody comes through the timing point. We're going to immediately see their bib number and their information if we've got a database loaded. We're going to see their information displayed on screen. At the starting line, we don't really care about seeing that kind of information because we're not trying to reconcile whether we got all the chip reads. It would be impossible. There's people coming by in large densities, and it's not possible for us to know. So by changing the scan to, say, 5 or 10, and I prefer 10, what you're telling Jaguar on the laptop is, look, don't bother the reader too much. It's busy right now reading a lot of chips. And so every 10 seconds, go out and collect all that data and bring it back. So it creates less load on the reader, and you'll find that your read rates will be just slightly better if you do that. Okay, so let me recap that. The scan for a finish line might be 1. And in fact, it usually is because we're trying to watch the chip reads, verify we got them, and then store them in the database or manually type in a bib number if we missed a read. So 1 is perfectly normal for scan rate, meaning again, every 1 second we'll go collect the chip reads. If I'm at the start of a race, I'll set this to 10 seconds. Now you'll notice there were a few other options. Why might I change this? Well, I'll give you a great example. Let's say you were timing a marathon with 40,000 people and you're at split 1. You'd like to know that you're getting reads, but you don't necessarily plan to sort of reconcile by typing in missed reads. That wouldn't be possible. I might set this to 3 or 4 seconds. In other words, a little more often so I'm comfortable and I know, oh, I'm getting the reads because they're coming in every 3 seconds. The danger in 10 seconds at a split point is you might sit there for 10 seconds and say, oh my gosh, I'm not getting any reads because nothing's showing up on screen. Okay? So again, 10 is what I use at a start. I'll use 1 at a finish line. Typically, if the race is perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 people or less, I'll still use 1 at my split points. Once the race hits about 4,000 to 5,000 people or more, I'll actually set my scan rate to 2 or 3 seconds because, again, there's such high densities. It's not like I'm really trying to see if I got all the reads anyway. It's just sort of puts less load on the reader. Okay, that's our scan rate. Finally, the last thing we want to talk about is the offset. Offset is very important if we're using the system as a backup point on a course. So for example, let's say you have a system at the starting line and your race has 2,000 to 3,000 people. It's always suggested that you have a second system as a backup to the start. So 30 to 40 feet behind the main starting line, you're going to have a second system. Anytime you're timing a race with several thousand people or more, you're going to want to do that. You need that level of redundancy. However, when we get the chip read at that point, if we get it there, we don't want to punish the runner. We want to make sure that they have the correct time. So one of the things we can do is we can set an offset. And what that tells Jaguar is that at this particular timing point, I want you to take 2 seconds off their time or add 2 seconds to their time to bring it back to what it would have been if we had in fact read it at the start line. Now, let's take the finish line, for example. Okay, you've got a system set up at the finish line. You've got a second Jaguar system set up 30 to 40 feet behind. When the runner crosses at the main finish line, we don't get the read. For whatever reason, we miss the read. We pick up the read at the backup finish line. We don't want them to be punished for that extra 2 or 3 seconds that it took to get there. So typically what we'll do is we'll set this to be 1 second subtracted for every 10 feet of distance. So if your backup finish line is 30 feet behind the primary finish line, I'll always set this to something like minus 3 seconds, meaning take 3 seconds off their time at the backup to bring it back to what it would have been at the primary. Okay, so now you understand these 4 features in Jaguar. Let's go set those in our defaults. This isn't a class about advanced default settings, but it's important that you understand this is what we're in fact about to set, and this is what these features do for you. We're going to go up to our Edit menu now. We're going to select our default settings, and when we do that, we'll see this pop-up window. You're probably familiar already with the file setup because we talked about that in a previous training module. Well, now we're going to go over to our General tab, and we're going to take a look, and if you look down, you'll see here are those settings that we just talked about. Scan rate, for example, I have it set to 10. Well, I'm going to change that to 1 because I'm going to say I'm at the finish line here. And in fact, if I go down 1, you'll see there's the database mode. So I'm going to set the database mode here to perhaps something like finish only. Okay, so I'll select that. There's finish only. Then my scan rate is right here. Okay, so I'm going to set that, offset. I'm going to set that to minus 2 seconds. Maybe I'm at the backup point, okay, on the course. So I'm going to set that to minus 2 seconds, the backup at the finish line, right? Then there's my minimum split time. Now, at a finish line, I don't need to use a minimum split time. There's no need for that. So this could actually be anything I want to. We're not worried about a minimum split at a finish line because it's not like we're timing multiple split points. So I'll usually set this to just 60 seconds and leave it at that. All right, let's kind of recap what we just did here. Let's go over it one more time so you really get it. Scan rate is how often we're going to go out and we're going to read the data that's sitting in the reader. In other words, how often are we going to go out and collect those chips that are waiting for us in memory. Okay, that's our scan rate. Our offset is if we want to subtract or add time to those chip reads that are coming in so that we can deal with situations where, for example, we're using a backup system at our finish line. Our minimum split time is very important if we're using a multi-database mode such as split 1, split 2, maybe split 3. We want to be able to set the minimum split to make sure the early chip reads aren't going in and they shouldn't because the runner or the cyclist hasn't actually completed the full course. And then finally, the database mode. We want to decide where is this system going to be used at, and we have all kinds of options in here that we can set as well. If you notice those options, it's just about everything you could ever imagine doing with Jaguar. We've given you an immense number of options. If there aren't enough options, as an example, let's say you want to have, split 1, 2, 3, and then you want to have 6, 7, 8. Well, you can actually, during a race and live, do this. You can change this. You could literally start off the race by saying, we're going to be recording split 1, 2, 3. But then later on, and you can do this live during the race in your defaults, or you can do it on the main screen of Jaguar, you could say, okay, now I'm going to change this, and I'm going to select maybe 6, 7, and 8. You actually are allowed to change the database mode anytime during the race. You can change the scan rate. You can actually change the offset, and you can change the minimum split time. Now, would I do that in the defaults? No. I would probably come back to the main screen and just make those changes here. Why? Defaults are really about setting options that you want to use when the system starts up. And how you want it to be configured for a particular race. But should you need to, you could make those changes here live, or you could come back over to your defaults and you could make the changes there as well. Okay, finally, let's talk about one last option that you see on your General tab of your software defaults. There's another option down here that says User Level. Now, you'll notice that currently it's set to Novice. I can change that to Expert. Essentially, today in the software, they're one and the same. In the future, and when we say future, sometime late in 2012, we'll actually enable this so that you have the choice of being a novice or expert. Today, it's automatically novice. What does that mean? It means that we're going to automatically assume, since you're new to version 4, that you want us to provide maximum help and to kind of look out for you as you're using the product. And so even if you set this to expert, it won't matter. We're still going to assume you're a novice. By the end of 2012, when a lot of you have 4.0 and you're becoming quite good and capable of using it with no problems, we're going to make this possible for you to then turn on the expert mode, which will reduce the number of warnings that you see on screen. Okay, now let's recap. What have we done here in this module? Well, first of all, we've learned about database mode. We've learned what our minimum split does. We've talked about our scan rate, which means how often are we going to go collect the chip reads. We've talked about our offsets. Once we've got all those, we can essentially go up to our defaults and we can change all of those under the General tab inside our default settings, and you'll see those again right here. One last thing you have to do that's so critically important. You've got to save your settings. Remember that they're just made in memory right now. They're not actually saved to the hard disk. So when we're done setting all of this, we need to go pick out a file. In my case, I'll call it Jaguar version 4 default file, and I'll save those out. It'll warn me that I already have that file, and I'll say, that's right, go ahead and overwrite it, and it says your defaults have been saved. So by doing that, we've now saved them. And in fact, the next time you start the Jaguar software, it's going to automatically load those defaults for you. If you want to override them, that's fine. You can always override them prior to the race or anytime during the race. But it's nice to know that when the software starts up on race morning, you've already got all of those features designed, set up, and they're going to load automatically for you. Well, thanks for attending this training module, and we'll see you on the next one very soon.